My name is Roy Tamella and I'm from the Flight Standards branch. CASA established a GRF implementation working group under the National Runway Safety Group, or NRSG, and that working group was established to look at runway hazard specific issues. It was established under the State Safety Program. It has broad industry and government participation, including pilots, aircraft and aerodrome operators, CASA, and Air Services Australia. And the NRSG is focused on controls for runway safety risks. So it was an appropriate forum to establish a working group specifically for the GRF to assist CASA with the policy. The goal of today's presentation is to demystify what GRF is and to provide reassurance that it's not hard to implement or require additional aerodrome resources. This presentation is very similar to one which was held in July this year for controlled aerodromes and those aerodromes with Part 121 scheduled operations, but this one is focused on non-controlled aerodromes. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and knowledge holders of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So these are the themes that we'll be covering today. And this isn't intended to be interactive, so can you please ask questions along the way? And I'll pause after each of the slide to see if there's any questions either in the chat or with any hands raised. So why are we introducing the GRF? It's not just because ICAO says so. GRF is addressing a hazard, and that hazard is reduced braking action due to changes to the runway surface friction. And that has a particular and a significant impact on aeroplane landing and takeoff performance and those distances which are normally increased. I'll just stop there. If there's any, I'm going to go into a lot of the details about the GRF. Are there any sort of opening questions from the group, or I'll just keep going? Okay, So this is a recent Australian example of the impacts of water on a runway. So this isn't to say that the water was the only factor, but it was a contributing factor. I can see one question in the chat is that it's only for sealed runways. It's not for gravel runways or grass runways, etc. So the water was a contributing factor. And these were some of the findings that were included in the ATSB report. And if we look at some of those wordings, there was poor braking effectiveness in wet conditions, aircraft overrunning the runway, rainfall impacts landing distance, runway maintenance and corrective action, means to identify water contamination, reduction in braking action from active rainfall. And our GRF implementation is intended to address all of those issues. If there are any questions in the chat that I miss, if one of my CASA people can let me know, and I will stop and answer those questions. So GRF is about standardising runway surface inspection, assessment, and reporting. There's a question about that report. It is the ATSB report into Newman. And the result of this standardised runway surface reporting is that benefits to pilots to determine the braking action and the landing and takeoff performance. And the landing and takeoff performance can result in additional landing and takeoff distances. That's why it's so important to pilots, is because of the impact on their operations in the most critical stages of takeoff and landing. I'll pause again because I did say I'd pause after each slide, so I'll just, in case there's any sort of questions along the way. So what is the GRF? So the reporting is of runways, and they are reported in runway thirds. We're not intending that this is an exact science, so aerodrome operators can approximate runway thirds with existing infrastructure, for example, taxiway runway intersections. So you're not expected to have theodolites or etc. to actually measure out the exact third of the runways. The actual runway condition code, or the RWYCC, is the actual number allocated to the runway surface condition. The lower the number, the worse the runway surface condition. So for example, 6 is for a dry runway and 1 is for a runway that would have ice on it. And the runway surface condition is a description of the actual runway surface. So the predominant ones we'll have in Australia are wet, slippery wet, or standing water. And the final output is a runway condition report, or RCR. And the minimum requirements for an RCR is the runway number, the runway condition code, and the runway surface description. And it is important to note here that Australia has gone, I think, a little bit better than ICAO, because in the ICAO RCR, the runway number is reported, but they do not have the prefix RWY in front of it. So in terms of, pilots and human factors, and even with automated NOTAM processing systems, with the RWY in front of the runway condition code, that indicates to everyone that it's actual runway report rather than just a series of numbers that may be slightly confusing to everyone. And just to reiterate, that RCR is reported in runway thirds. So I'll stop there, given that's the sort of effectively the format of an RCR. Any questions or queries on that? Okay. So it's important that although we have runway inspection requirements at different times, the reports for RCRs are only required if there are known aeroplane operations. So if there's no aeroplanes operating at the runway at the time of a report being required, then no AROs or aerodrome reporting officers need to be providing those reports. And that's a fairly critical aspect for aerodromes to understand. The reports are only required if airplanes are operating. So I'll just pause again.
Roy, I'm really sorry. Mel here from Narrowmine. I am completely new to this, so it might be a dumb question, but just to understand, so these reports would be done, what frequency are we talking about here? And then understanding that they're not needed if the runway's not in use.
So yeah, that's a very good question. We will go into a lot more detail later. So effectively, I'll go into the timing of these reports as well. So you would only do a report if there is a contamination of the runway surface or it's slippery wet. So for the 300 plus certified aerodromes that are non-controlled or where ATC is no longer there, you don't have to report wet runways. So if it's raining and the runway's wet, there's other mechanisms for the airplane operators and pilots to take account of the wet runways through their pre-flight planning requirements under the operations regulations. So for the vast majority of certified aerodromes that are non-controlled, it's only if you're going to have events that lead to standing water on your runway, or if there's a build-up of rubber or other contaminants and it's become slippery wet. So they're the only two situations for a runway third where you're likely to provide a runway condition report.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So as I said, the runway condition code actually reports to relates to the surface description. So if you look at that table, you can see that a runway condition code number relates to an additional braking action. So we've broken up in our regulations and also in our guidance material, we've, if you like, broken it up into wet and dry runway conditions and to snow and ice runway conditions, because predominantly in Australia we'll have wet and dry runways, and there's very few aerodromes that experience snow ice conditions, and they can have other mechanisms to, if they don't want to do an RCR, they can also just have the option to completely close the runway. So once I get to the bottom of this slide, I'll actually pause because I noticed a couple of questions coming in through the chat. So these are the most prevalent conditions for all of our 330 certified aerodromes. And again, as I said, it's not intended to be an exact science. So we are expecting that you can determine whether there's standing water if by visual observation. Slippery runways obviously are more dependent on the pilot's reported braking action. But I'm going to repeat this a few times. It's important to know your own runway. So if you have a runway or runways and there are periods of extensive rain and and you experience on the runway that there are patches or water patches where the water is pooling or ponding, then you should be in a situation where you know that there will be a requirement for a standing water runway condition report. So if I could get someone I'll just see if I can actually see what's in the chat. Bear with me a sec. I don't want to lose the presentation. Okay, so I think the first question is, I'll just go back to the top. So if less than 1/3 of a runway is wet, we then don't provide a report to anyone at non-control. So as I said, we don't report wet runways at all at non-controlled aerodromes. So basically you can discard those, and you only need to report if it's contaminated, being with standing water, or that it's slippery wet for a runway third. And the other question, would this apply for short notice like RFDS coming in? Again, we went to great lengths with the National Runway Safety Group to come up with, if you like, a definition within the Part 139 Manual of Standards as to how do you determine, known operations. And so if they're not scheduled and you haven't been given advance warning that an aircraft is coming in, or an airplane rather, we don't expect aerodrome operators to go out in the middle of the night just because it's raining, etc. So we would expect that if you don't know as an aerodrome operator that an aircraft is coming in, or an airplane, that you don't need to do the inspection or the report. I think that was answering the other question, was please confirm that reports are required for scheduled operations only. It's not just scheduled though, it's also known. So, and the language in the 139 miles, if an aircraft operator has notified the aerodrome operator in advance that there's going to be operations, then that's the same as if there were scheduled operations. So there would be an expectation that those reports are provided. And let me just, before moving on, are there any questions on that topic? Okay. So there's for some reason, I lose my notes page when, thank you. I think I found out how to get them back. So this is how the runway condition code relates to braking action. As a runway condition code gets lower, the braking action can deteriorate. And it is important for aerodrome operators to understand the links and importance of the runway condition code to airplane performance and why they need to know what those code numbers are. So I'll pause there if there's any questions about how those code numbers equate to braking performance. So how can this look in the cockpit? So basically, this is a screenshot from the multi-part advisory circular. So for a multifunction control display unit, you can actually input the runway condition code directly into the unit, whether it's a 6543, etc., and that automatically then sets the landing distance performance factor. So whether it's 1.15 or 1.5, etc. Now, if you don't have a smart flight management system, for some aeroplane flight manuals or AFMs, the runway condition code can be included in the manual in order to, again, to determine landing and takeoff performance and safety factors. And lastly, but certainly not least, even if as a pilot you're not familiar with the runway condition code number as such, given that we're also providing the runway surface description, this informs the pilot of the actual runway surface conditions. So again, we have those. The common ones in Australia will be, you could have potentially wet if you're also reporting standing water. So we have wet, standing water, and slippery wet. Again, I'll just mention here, we've gone potentially one better than ICAO. So ICAO reports a slippery wet runway with a runway condition code of 3 instead of 5. So again, from a human factors perspective, that might not be as easy for a pilot to recognise that because there's a different code number between 5 and 3, that the surface description is wet in both cases. They wouldn't understand the particular hazards associated with slippery wet runways. So we actually use the surface description of slippery wet, which is not required by ICAO. And I'll show an example of that shortly. And under parts 91, 121 and 135 for general operating rules and air transport operations, pilots need to take into account the runway surface condition. So for them, it's mandatory that they need to consider it if they're aware of it. I've just paused there because I think a couple of other questions have come in. Okay. So the first one I can see here is, how are these reports submitted? Are they similar to issuing a NOTAM? So the answer to that question is yes. So for a runway condition report, for a contaminated runway, you would provide those to both the NOTAM office and sorry, I'll just reiterate that one. So for the RCRs for the contaminated runways, for non-controlled aerodromes, they're just submitted to the NOTAM office. For the controlled aerodromes, they go to both the NOTAM office and to ATC. So from that report to the NOTAM office, then they will issue an RCR as in the form of what ICAO calls a SNOTAM, which is in the same sort of format, which I'll go through shortly. Again, we'll probably mention this later, but also if you have a means to, with Unicom or Certified Air Ground Radio Service, you can provide those directly to pilots. And how would flight crews report subsequent braking actions at a non-controlled aerodrome? So that's a good question, Julio. So under the operations rule, there is a requirement for aircraft operators to report braking actions to the aerodrome operator or to ATC. So if there is an uncontrolled airdrome, then it is a responsibility for the pilots under Part 91 to advise the airdrome operator that the braking action was not as good as expected. So instead of being good, it was fair to good, or medium to good. So that would indicate that the runway surface is potentially slippery wet. So in terms of runway serviceability inspections, it's probably important to indicate what hasn't changed. So runway inspections have always been required after heavy winds, storms, or heavy rain. Again, and this is as soon as possible, not immediately. And the reason we do these reports or these inspections, it's not just because of the impact of potentially standing water, but they could also cause foreign object debris or other runway damage. But they are the most likely event to cause standing water. The other times that the serviceability inspections are required if the meteorological changes cause the runway condition code or the runway surface condition to change. So that you may have had a wet runway that was a 5 and now it's changed to a runway condition code of 3 or worse, or a 2 potentially with standing water, or the runway surface and condition has changed from something that was potentially could have been standing water and is now gone to wet, and then the RCR would no longer be required. Again, these additional serviceability inspections, apart from the heavy or prolonged rainfall, are only required if there's known aeroplane operations. And the reason we check for these conditions, which would require a runway surface condition report, is that pooling or ponding or poor drainage of water is something that should be detected. And as I'll provide later on, this can actually have an impact on the maintenance of the runway. But I'll go through that a bit later on. So again, I'll pause there. So this is one of the questions that came up quite a lot during the implementation of the GRF, and this was also with the controlled airdromes earlier on in August. So the timings of the inspections has not changed. So there's no inspections required in the middle of the night if there's no aeroplane operations. So again, it's only if you've got the aeroplane operations and during those operations that the RCRs or the inspections are required, other than the ones where you've got the severe rain and heavy storms. Those inspections are still required as soon as possible. I'll pause there because that's the one that has caused people to think that they need more AROs or more staff in the middle of the night, but that's not the case. So I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that aspect of the GRF reporting. So this is a description of a runway divided.
Sorry, I do have a question. Sorry, with the
go ahead. Yeah.
So with the last slide, the second point, as soon as possible after a severe wind event, severe storm, or period of heavy prolonged rainfall. What would you define as soon as possible? So we typically only have staff Monday to Friday, and we generally wouldn't have any known or scheduled flights over the weekend. Would it still be expected that we would go out on like a Saturday morning or a Sunday?
That's a good question, and it's really, as I said, that hasn't changed. So that's the same requirement that's been in the manual of standards for 20 years. So if you've got no staff there other than Monday to Friday, then we're not expecting you to go out on a weekend and do those inspections.
Okay, thanks. I know it's been around for a while, but we actually have been unsure for a while, so that's good to clear up.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, that's right. We weren't intending to change that, but it did become something that probably reflected something that people were interested in knowing about or having more clarity about from previously.
Yeah, thanks.
I just see a question come in, so let me just go back to the chat. So what do we do with the RCR at an uncontrolled aerodrome that is just wet? File it. Well, you wouldn't. The question is, you wouldn't do an RCR if it's only wet. So the RCR for non-controlled aerodromes is only if it's more than wet, which would be standing water or slippery wet. So again, this is what I said earlier. It's a matter of an aerodrome operator being familiar with their runway surface and what the impact of heavy rain or steady rain is on those surfaces. So if there is no experience of the, because the runways are either grooved or they've got the transverse slope. So if there's no pooling or ponding of water on the runways, then there would be no need then to do any RCRs. So all good. Things would just be as they are now. Okay. So again, this is again from the multi-part advisory circular. So this is a runway that's divided into thirds. And as you can see, the main reason this diagram's in there is to explain how you work out whether a third of a runway needs to be reported. So there's no data quality requirements. We don't expect in Australia for this to be an exact science, but greater than 25% of a runway third that's contaminated needs to be reported. So that's more than 25% of a runway third that has standing water on it, if I use standing water as a common example. And what we did with our National Runway Safety Group, what the airlines were interested in, if a runway third has less than or equal to 25% of it is wet, sorry, it has standing water, then we only report it as wet with the runway condition of code. So just to repeat that, so if you've got less than or equal to 25% of a runway third with standing water on it, we report it as wet and a runway condition code of 5. ICAO does believe, or not only believe, but they say and require that if a runway third is 25% or less contaminated, they consider it to be as good as a dry runway with a runway condition code of 6. But we believe that it's more accurate to actually just report that one as wet, even though because it has some contamination on it. Now, we do say if in doubt, over-report instead of under-report, but you know, it's important just to give the pilot the best representation of the runway surface to enable them to make those critical decisions for taking off and landing in particular. Is there any questions on what the runway third is or how to report the runway thirds in terms of the percentages? Okay. Now this is in Australia, this will be the most common scenario that the runways are wet. As I said, this is only required to be reported at controlled aerodromes and only if ATC are present, you know, they haven't gone home for the night. And the reason this is the case is that we've already had this requirement at controlled aerodromes for, again, 20 years, where ATC use the fact whether a runway is wet or dry in determining the runway in use, selecting the runway in use. So this is not an impact on ATC at these aerodromes. So what we've put into the manual standards is if an aerodrome has aerodrome operator has an agreement with ATC, they don't need to report the wet runways either. And I pretty safely report now, I think that all controlled aerodromes, which is approximately 27, have agreements in place with ATC. And then these wet runways are reported by the ATIS, which we've got an example of in that slide, or by ATC via the voice. And as I said, for NOTAMs, even at controlled aerodromes, they're never issued for a wet runway. Just pause there for a sec. So this is something that doesn't really impact on a non-controlled aerodrome unless that they're just, if they are doing an RCR or runway condition report for a contaminated runway that has standing water on a third, then a third of it may also be wet, and so you would be reporting the runway as with standing water and being wet, and I'll go into that example next. Okay, this is the slippery wet runways. Now, slippery wet is not in the definition of contaminated, but it has a particular hazard due to the reduced runway surface friction. And for these slippery wet runways, these are the only times we require percentages of the runway thirds to be reported. And so how that is broken down to is, again, it's percentages of a runway third. So they, excuse me, they are 25%, 50%, 75% or 100% of a runway third. And we've got an example there of how that's reported. As I said before, we actually use the description of slippery wet for the surface description, which ICAO doesn't require. But from a human factors perspective, it does indicate to pilots that the runway is definitely not as good as a wet one, and it's particularly hazardous. However, that doesn't mean that runways are always going to be slippery wet, because we have other requirements in the manual of standards that should alleviate this hazard becoming or existing. So serviceability inspections are required to check for build-up of rubber or other contaminants, which may reduce surface friction. Additionally, runways are required to be maintained in accordance with the surface texture or friction standards. So it's not that these slippery wet runways are going to happen often. And as I said before, if a runway aerodrome operator is familiar with their runways and there is an incident where pilots have reported that the braking action is less than good for a wet runway, then they should be able to be in a position to be ready for those runway condition reports if those circumstances exist. I'll just pause there again. Now, this is the most common one in the Australian environment. This is standing water on runways. This is the most likely source of runway contamination, and the basic format is the runway number, the runway condition code, and the surface description for each runway third. As you can see, we've provided a couple of examples where you may have a standing water on a runway third or more than 1/3. And if you do know the depth of the water from previous experience, you can include that in your runway condition report. Again, I think I've got a couple of questions, so I'll go back to those. Just bear with me. And I've got a question, how long till you review your report? So there is no time limits on these reports. Obviously, I wouldn't leave one report going overnight, but you should only need to change your report if the conditions have changed. So again, the reason we have those inspections is if the runway condition code has changed, either up or down, or the actual runway surface description has changed. That's the time when you would review your report. So again, as I said, know your own runway, measure the depth. You can measure the depth when aeroplane operations aren't taking place. So you don't have to have personnel out there in harm's way when there's aircraft operations taking place. And as I'll talk about a little bit later on about the airdrome manual, if you do have standing water as a regular event, setting aside those requirements for runway design and inspection and maintenance, etc., you can always record a copy of that RCR in your airdrome manual, so it's ready to roll out when those conditions exist, without having necessarily airdrome personnel out on the runway during the rain. And just pause for a sec. Okay, so bear with me. This is a as we operate a blue ice runway, how does this relate to us? Would that be dry for standard operations? If I'm assuming that a blue ice runway is that in Antarctica, that's not considered a sealed runway, so the GRF doesn't apply. Next one we have is, do we submit the report as a NOTAM and then cancel the NOTAM the runway contamination is cleared? Or are we emailing the report to the NOTAM office? So we have had conversations again within the group, National Runway Safety Group, about this cancellation. Effectively, after the RCR has been issued and the report and the conditions have no longer exist, then the NOTAM can be cancelled, and we've had those conversations with the NOTAM office, and that subject heading will be in the cancellation NOTAM, so pilots will be aware of what RCR is being cancelled. Next one. So this is how or who to make the runway condition reports to. So as I said, wet runways, it's only at controlled aerodromes, and the other surface conditions are reported to ATC if they're present, and the NOTAM office. So for non-controlled aerodromes, you'll only be reporting it to the NOTAM office. But pilots are still receiving these contaminated surface reports by the provision of flight information service by ATC at non-controlled aerodromes. So if there's standing water, and that report is made to the NOTAM office, the ATC will provide those NOTAMs to any affected pilots going to those aerodromes. So we've got that sort of, if you like, a lookalike situation for control towers for contaminated runway surface reporting. Again, if you have Unicom or CAGRAS, because those staff are trained, you can report directly the contaminated surface runway reports via Unicom or CAGRAS. Again, I'll pause there if there's any questions. Excuse me. So what about training? AROs need to be trained to conduct GRF runway serviceability inspections and reports. So where do they get that training? We have a multi-part advisory circular that provides extensive guidance. The AC has links to the ICAO template for runway surface assessment and reporting, and we actually have a copy of that template for wet and dry runways in the actual AC, but you have links to the ICAO websites for the actual fillable PDFs if you would like to download them and put them in your airdrome manual. The AC also has a sample training syllabus, not just for airdrome operators, but also to aircraft operators and pilots. ICAO does also provide e-learning and online training, not just to airdrome operators and pilots and aircraft operators. It starts about at $150 US. And we believe this is sufficient training given our relatively benign conditions in Australia and the fact that aerodrome operators should be familiar with their runways if they're susceptible to surface water pooling or ponding or being slippery wet. Let me just go to the chat. So how do we include this in our aerodrome manual? I'll go over this in the next couple of slides later on, but basically on our website, we already have if you like, sample aerodrome manual content that can be included as an appendix to the aerodrome manual. And then eventually we will have the sample aerodrome manual and the manual assessment and authoring tool, the MAT, updated so that you can actually include the runway surface inspection reporting in your actual aerodrome manual. So we already have the guidance there, so you can put it in there, and I'll just touch on that again in the next couple of slides. Now, in the very next slide, in fact, so the aerodrome manual needs to include procedures for conducting GRF serviceability in inspections and reports. And we recommend, as I've said a couple of times, is that you have common RCR and NOTAM examples in your actual manual. And as I said, the draft guidance material on the CASA website does include that in that draft material for your aerodrome manuals. And again, I would just reiterate that you should know your own runway, so you should know whether there's any times that with severe rain, whether it will have standing water, or with previous pilot experience or reports that whether or not parts of it are slippery wet. Any other questions on the aerodrome manual content? So, apologies if you've addressed this, but are CASA working with the AAA to include GRF training in their ARO refresher courses? This question has come up. I have covered it off, well, potentially, but this stage we're not intending on providing any more training with the AAA or separately on what's already in the advisory circular and the links to ICAO material and worksheets, etc. If the need arises where that would be beneficial, CASA would be happy to work with the AAA, and I think we sort of mentioned this at the previous webinar without giving any commitments from either the AAA or CASA. But if there's a need identified by industry, CASA would be happy to engage with the AAA as to whether any further training would be beneficial. So as I said, it's not just reporting of inspection and reporting of runways that that's the end result, if you like. So what we have is the design and maintenance of runways which are intended to prevent pooling, ponding, or poor drainage of water. So runways are intended to be designed with transverse slopes to prevent pooling and ponding. Also, a lot of runways are grooved that allow water to leave the runway surface. But however, if pooling or ponding or poor drainage of water is discovered during an inspection, then it's required to undertake remedial action as soon as possible. But again, we're not putting a time frame on that. And the expectation, which is we put into the 139 miles through a note, isn't that you're going to completely reseal or overlay a runway. That would be quite expensive, and it's not practical. So the expectation is that you would, as part of your maintenance program, repair depressions and surface irregularities. Okay, I'll move forward. This isn't a joke. The idea is it's not meant to be so hard. So, runway serviceability, as I said, runway serviceability inspections are already required after bad weather. Wet runways don't need to be reported at non-controlled aerodromes. Snow and ice is very rare, and the runway can actually be closed, rather than having the runway condition reports. And the standing water is our most common contaminant, and we have runway design and maintenance requirements that sort of prevent that from happening. Visual observation is acceptable, so you don't need fancy measuring equipment. Standing water on a runway should be known to an airdrome operator, and you can record the RCR and NOTAM in your airdrome manual, so you've got ready access to that if the runway surface contamination occurs. Any comments on those aspects? So the transition. So we've already had the first transition for controlled airdromes and certified airdromes with scheduled Part 121 operations. So that occurred on the 1st of August this year. The main feedback was about getting all of the agreements in place between the airdrome operators and ATC. And so, as I said before, I believe all of those are in place now. So they've been operating up for the RCRs if required, for standing water for 3 months, nearly 4 months. And ATC have continued to report wet runways on the ATIS or via voice broadcast. So for the rest of the non-controlled certified airdromes, the implementation date is 1st of February 2025. But the way the manual standards is written, you can implement now if you're ready, with all of that assistance in the advisory circular, etc. Any questions on that transition period? So this slide here is not intended to indicate that the GRF is child's play, but what it is meant to indicate is that the runway surface inspection and assessment requirements, what gets reported to pilots and what pilots take into account for landing and takeoff performance, is all linked together to ensure that we have safe runway operations. So they're all pieces of a puzzle that fit neatly together. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope the webinar has demystified the GRF, provided evidence that it's not so hard, assured you or reassured you that you won't require extra staff or AROs. And again, just know your runway surface, particularly after heavy rain, etc. So if there's any other questions, and again, as I said earlier, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available on our CASA YouTube channel shortly after today. Just got a question. I think I just answered that question. So is this presentation available later? Yes, so on our CASA YouTube channel, this will be available. So I'll just pause again if there's any final questions or chats. So, and also just to let you know that our airdrome surveillance team led by Darren Angelo and the airdrome inspectors have been listening to this presentation as they did the previous one, and they'll be there to assist industry with any questions that you may have. So you can contact your local airdrome inspector or the airdrome's mailbox at CASA if you have any questions. We're more than happy to answer those. So again, on behalf of all of the industry members of the National Runway Safety Group that were involved in developing and finalising these policies for controlled and non-controlled airdromes, I just want to again thank them very much. Without them, I can assure you that that collaboration, we wouldn't have had a reasonable and policy that could be adopted in Australia for our conditions. So thanks to everyone from the industry working group and NRSG that were involved in assisting CASA with this project. So on behalf of CASA, thanks for everyone for listening. Very much appreciated.